Nintendo has certainly attracted their share of criticism in the past year or so, but this month it's Sony that has stolen a march in terms of controversy. A press announcement on the 1st of July confirmed that Sony will discontinue physical releases of their games after the end of the next calendar year and will move to a digital-only future. In this video, I want to break down Sony's decision in the context of their own financial plans, consider these issues more broadly, not just for Sony and Microsoft, but for other adjacent industries, then consider the short, medium, and long-term consequences both for Nintendo and the games industry as a whole, and end up with speculating a little bit about how physical games could be saved through an application of Nintendo's infamous blue ocean thinking. Firstly, though, let's consider the deep background to the kind of problems facing this industry. For much of the 80s and early 90s, cartridges were the gold standard of game provision, allowing decent capacity and instantaneous plug-and-play action on consoles. By the mid-90s, as games required ever more data and cartridge capacity became more limited for what was needed, CDs became the default for everyone except Nintendo, who stubbornly stuck to cartridges for the Nintendo 64 and paid a steep price. While Nintendo's own games were able to be built and compressed for the space limitation of a games cartridge, consumers looked askance at the absolutely walloping prices, sticker prices indeed, that wouldn't return until the Switch 2 generation, while third parties balked, and none more significantly than Nintendo's longtime partner, Square. When Final Fantasy VII launched in Japan, it was the first mainline Final Fantasy not to launch on a Nintendo console, but rather on Sony's all-new PlayStation machine, shifting millions of units at launch and causing an absolute sensation. In 1997, the major event movie at the cinema was James Cameron's Titanic, but the word on the street was that in Japan, similar-sized queues existed for people desperate to get a hold of Final Fantasy VII. Before the N64 generation was done, Nintendo pulled a Sega, dabbling with a short-lived disk drive accessory which never hit the West, before pivoting to mini-discs and finally, for 2 generations, giving up the ghost and going for optical discs before the logistics of the Switch pulled them back to a storage medium that, in appearance more than technology, resembled the game cartridges of old in the form of the game cards that we now see on the Switch and Switch 2. The reason for this historical detour is to illustrate both that Nintendo is willing to stick to older technology when there's a clear benefit to doing so. The immediacy of the plug-and-play experience and the speed that at the time optical media could not provide were clearly benefits they wanted to cultivate. But they also ultimately needed to concede to financial reality and public perception. Where Nintendo move next depends very much on their judgment of where things are settling in the market and what potential new approaches they can bring to things. Another piece of history that bears an interesting comparison to Sony's current situation, though. In 2016, Apple decided to strip from its MacBook laptop lineup all ports except for USB-C. For many people who are nursing a huge number of different connections, this forced those people to buy an assortment of high-priced dongles, a name which was hardly correlated with the sleek, chic reputation Apple has spent years trying to cultivate. After this announcement, Apple's Phil Schiller went on a press offensive, saying, "Our customers are so passionate, which is amazing. We care about what they love and what they are worried about, and it's our job to help people through these changes. We know we made good decisions about what to build in the new MacBook Pro, and that the result is the best notebook ever made, but it might not be right for everyone on day one. That's okay. Some people felt that way about the first iMac, and that turned out pretty good." Compare and contrast that confident and at least vaguely emotionally connected statement with Sony's announcement. As consumer preferences and the broader entertainment industry continue to shift away from physical discs to digital, physical game disc production for all new games releasing on PlayStation consoles will be discontinued starting January 2028. Following this date, new games will be available on PlayStation Store and at retailers in digital formats only. This transition has no impact on games that already released or will be releasing prior to January 2028 in disc format. This is a natural direction for Sony Interactive Entertainment to adapt to consumer trends as the general preference for digital media significantly outpaces physical discs. This transition will enable us to align more closely with how most of our community prefers to access and play games today. We'll continue to prioritize our resources to drive innovation in how players can access games and provide choices as to where players prefer to purchase new games, whether that's at retailers or PlayStation Store. We remain committed to delivering a world-class gaming experience to our fans, and we thank you for your continued support. Nice and cuddly at the end there, but there is a critical difference in the tone between this announcement and the Apple one. Apple were deliberately leading the market, trying to leverage their position as the market leader to force an unpopular but, in their eyes, necessary change. There are people who yearn for multiple ports still, and it does create some issues even now, but by and large, despite an absolute maelstrom of consternation early on, they were crystal clear on why. It allowed for simpler, thinner models, and they basically dared their customers to blink. Some did, but Apple products remain successful to this day, and some products even have a different port as well. This is a privilege that large and successful companies can and do exercise on occasion to challenge their audience, going against their grain, riling up their customer base to make a move that they feel is necessary in their own interests. Nintendo has spent a year as the internet's whipping boy until this week being reinvented as a savior of gaming for daring to be the first to put an $80 price tag on a video game, and while there are many reasons for people to be critical of that move, they were clear about their reasons. They thought the value of the game reflected that. Agree or disagree, they were upfront, and a year or two down the line, things seem to have settled down a little bit to at least a grudging acceptance that this is the new reality, if not a full-throated endorsement of the new pricing. While Nintendo may now have a summer of enjoying refugees from PlayStation's ecosystem discovering the wonders of hybrid gameplay, in the medium term, Sony knows that they will largely, in the words of Jesse Pinkman, keep getting away with it. For Sony, though, the difficulty is that they haven't taken the Apple approach of trust us, it'll work out, we're right all along. They haven't taken the Nintendo approach of we just think that's just what the game is worth. They've tried to assert consumer preference as their driver, but of course no major consumer change is intrinsically popular to start with. That's just not how these things tend to work. While Apple and Nintendo may have had other side reasons, their explanations for controversial changes at least have the benefit of being fundamentally true. I suspect if Sony were making a more honest and forthright statement of their decision to make a change, they might have discussed some different things, as well as the admittedly fairly significant push towards digital adoption in many markets. They may have discussed the fact that escalating memory prices mean that it's more important than ever to make margins, and squeezing retailers out of the picture and taking their cut is a short-term way to achieve this without raising prices for customers. Plus, of course, they save a lot of money on distribution costs as well. They might have said that in many countries they need to demonstrate they're making moves on climate objectives and reducing emissions through the manufacture, transport and distribution of tens if not hundreds of millions of plastic cases and discs every year, and they figure that this is as good a way to attract some positive publicity as any. They might have said that they actually find that this is a long-term ambition of theirs, which aligns with their own corporate goals. And of course, a very recent investor Q&A at Sony illustrates what I've suggested for a while might be their long-term strategy. Let's read and talk more afterwards. Question. Given PlayStation's 125 million monthly annual users accounts as of March 2026 and shift to an engagement-driven recurring revenue model, it seems logical to expand content across platforms and evolve beyond a console-centric business. Where do you see Sony Interactive Entertainment in 10 years? Will it remain a hardware gatekeeper reliant on console economics and profit from software, or transition towards an IP-led content platform with hardware as just one distribution channel? The response was, the value of our proprietary device lies in the experience, not the hardware itself. As a dedicated gaming device, it provides seamless, immediate access to content, unlike general-purpose devices which involve multiple layers before gameplay. We aim to expand reach across diverse playstyles and environments while maintaining confidence in our first-party software. At the same time, most of the value of our ecosystem is driven by third-party publishers who benefit from our large install base, strong community engagement, and monetization tools. This supports a shift towards a true digital platform business. While opportunities exist beyond console, e.g. mobile and PC, we aim to proceed carefully, ensuring we are not constrained by our own hardware ecosystem. Overall, we see expansion potential over the next 5 years. Okay, so there's a lot to break down here, but one key bit is that the experience rather than the hardware is critical. And of course, they're saying they aim to proceed carefully. They're making sure they're not constrained by their own hardware ecosystem. And of course, by making the move to digital before PlayStation 6, their hope will be that by the end of the PlayStation 6 generation, if they are looking to move away from a purely console-based approach, then they have maximum flexibility to do it because people will have been bought in to the PlayStation digital ecosystem and therefore will be inclined to follow it wherever Sony decides to lead them. Of course, another thing to consider is the breakdown of Sony's sales over recent years. Games went from 10% of their income in 2012 to 32% in 2023 for game and network services, unhelpfully abridged as G and NS on this chart, in which they decide to have a load of acronyms and not really define all of them, and to change them from pie chart to pie chart, but there we go. Entertainment, technology and services has also grown out of the wreckage of their prior imaging, mobile and home entertainment divisions. Other areas like their financial services and imaging sensing, or in old speak, devices such as cameras, remain unaffected. Essentially, therefore, what Sony are doing and looking to continue to do is to integrate all of these kinds of functions together. Long gone are the days where you might buy discreetly a video player, a camera, a laptop, a film, and a games console. Increasingly, one device will handle multiple ends. Also, they don't want games shuttered off as a separate thing in the corner of an electronics store. They explicitly want to create IP that flows between different content brackets: games, films, television, and increasingly merchandise. Last of Us is a good example of this, which Sony use in their recent illustration to their investors. What they absolutely do not want is their tech empire of free-flowing IP being unduly limited by physical restrictions such as the need to place a disc into a particular device. They want to sell devices where games, films, and technology are integrated and presented to you seamlessly without any possible interruptions. Now, all of that is a long-term plan, potentially decades in the making, but crisis does have a habit of accelerating trends along. Look how video conferencing went from a niche activity, enjoyed principally, it seems, by Shigeru Miyamoto, as he was able to stay in Kyoto and still harangue his beleaguered Tokyo team on the progress of Super Mario Galaxy through the early 2000s, and yet it went to being an absolute staple of almost every office, every education, even social environment during 2020. I don't think Sony would have felt the need to pull the trigger so urgently without the immediate spectre of the memory price issues breathing down their neck, but I also don't think that this is at all misaligned with their long-term intentions. I think this is absolutely something they have wanted to do for a long time. The question was always going to be about timing, and the question in particular would always have been about PlayStation 6. It's very difficult to make changes mid-generation after all, and with a new console model expected in the next 2 years, it makes sense for this change to come into effect. Announcing it now allows for the hype and hubbub to die down a little bit before they get into really launching the PlayStation 6 itself. Now, given the long cross-platform period we see these days, it would be difficult to offer physical products on one console, not the other, as this might be a source of ongoing friction for adopters. Hence, the decision needs to be made now. There are various justifications being offered, percentages of games that are digital and such like, but of course with DLC sales, digital-only indie titles and digital-only models, Sony has been greasing the wheels of this truck for a long time. It probably is true that at a certain point, the fixed costs of maintaining physical game production create some kind of issues for them, but let's face it, for the GTA 6s of the world, it's not something that couldn't be accounted for by introducing differential pricing for digital and physical games, or through simply just having a larger advertising push. My hunch is that they thought this choice was a decade or more off, but they brought it forward because the games market is looking far more febrile than it once was. However, there is another reason to consider, the reason that dare not speak its name for the companies, but which many people have been pointing out. Digital ownership is not what many people would consider true ownership in the traditional sense, but is more a user license, a license that was revoked recently for 551 films in some territories earlier this year, meaning that films people had bought outright were spirited away in the night due to unspecified contractual agreements that overrode people's rights to what they'd considered their property. That one of those films was Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which is about robots destroying the world, has for many people just added the cherry of irony on the ice cream sundae of consternation. In truth, this was always an issue. Having one upfront charge for the customer but an obligation for the producer to provide access in perpetuity was never going to fly as a long-term business idea, and we've seen the closure of services on past Nintendo consoles in recent years as a grim reminder that time comes for us all. And if you are reliant on some kind of external provider to continue to allow you access to your purchase, then really you don't have that purchase at all. There's a lot more we could say here, since the rights and wrongs of digital ownership is a deeper and more philosophical topic, but for now let's just consider Sony's view of things, or indeed any video game manufacturer. For decades, physical media has been imperfect. Watching Terminator 2 on VHS was a vastly different experience from watching it at your local multiplex. DVD improved things a little. Blu-ray improved things all the more, and now the potential exists to bounce the film between your phone, your tablet, and your widescreen television in glorious 4K, subject to regulatory compliance and terms and conditions, of course. For the consumer, it sounds lovely, but there is a difficulty for the company. The same, of course, was even more pronounced in games, with console generations sometimes rattling past at a rate of 2 per decade, and while many offered some kind of forward or backward compatibility, it was frequently the case that games would simply become re-released and offered again to the marketplace. At every opportunity where there was technological transition points, there were new opportunities to sell each of those products as new, and with companies like Sony and indeed Nintendo having such deep content libraries, this was a significant revenue stream indeed, and still is. However, that revenue stream appears to be drying up. In the case of video, after purchasing Sarah Connor's second apocalypse-averting adventure on home video in 1992, on DVD in 2002, on Blu-ray in 2012, and on streaming 4K video in 2022, there is potentially nowhere left to go, and so the only remaining judgment day is for the accountants at Sony, unless they can think of another way to resell Terminator 2. Now, that doesn't mean that it's good corporate practice to go swiping from people's personal libraries films that they have previously been sold. This kind of thing does generate opprobrium, and although arguably there's also very little people can do about it in the world without recourse to physical ownership, large corporations are not immortal, and it's unwise to antagonize public opinion and indeed potentially regulators and political movements too egregiously. Better to avoid the whole messy business in the first place by having people pay for ongoing services, a subscription-based model that seemed to be the salvation of the movie industry when Netflix piloted it. While there's a first-mover advantage to doing something new, when there are approximately a squillion streamers and the healthy revenue sales from advertising breaks have dried up, this move might not, and indeed doesn't, look so attractive. However, they can't reset the media landscape back 20 years. That ship has long since sailed, Leonardo DiCaprio and all. The only thing left to do is win, and Sony is in a decent position to win. If they double down with the full force of their entertainment and creative offerings, Sony is well placed. It's the 4th biggest American film studio, it's the 16th biggest tech company by revenue, and it has huge international name recognition. In any event, it's not like they can afford to blink with other major corporate entities looking to bridge tech and entertainment themselves. Quite how Sony monetize their content going forward will remain an open question, and is something that they will continue to explore, but allowing permanent ownership of the best and greatest version of each of their products is definitely not in their interests. On Microsoft's end, rumours have emerged that they actually nixed an ad campaign in 2025 exploring the argument around digital and physical, with the likely implication being that they are too on the cusp of pulling a Sony and jettisoning physical games. Microsoft is a different company from Sony in many respects, but they're similar in that they're technology companies that have moved into entertainment, and they're quite highly diversified. However, their roots in the game industry are not all that deep, and it seems to me that Microsoft will, sooner or later, and probably sooner, follow Sony through the door that's been kicked open. Now, if people are to commit to digital media, that requires several assumptions to be true and widely accepted, and I think we need to test some of those assumptions. Assumption 1, that corporations are good guarantors of the safety of a creative content library. That is often, but not always the case, at least not without some controversy. Star Wars traditionalists who want to relive the 1977 original unaffected by subsequent revisions are out of luck, as are BBC television fans who want to watch certain episodes of iconic programmes like Dad's Army and Doctor Who, which were consigned to skips or overwritten to make space years ago. Personally, one of the great sadnesses I have is the erasure of the original source code of Panzer Dragoon Saga, the Sega Saturn classic, Not because I don't own a copy myself, but because if any of those discs do degrade over time, as indeed they probably might, I will lose access on original hardware to one of my all-time favourite titles. It's frankly unlikely that any corporate preservation crime will be so devastating that it will move the dial and affect the buying habits of mass consumers, but it's not without possibility. Still, we've stumbled here onto assumption 2, that consumers are static in their preferences. Generally, it takes a lot to override sheer convenience. In a commercial environment, trying to introduce artificial friction rarely works because you're just ceding ground to competitors. Apple could do it with its cables because they understood that it wasn't a deal breaker in the short term and wouldn't be an issue for people in the long term. Plus, they had a massive market leader advantage, and many people in other companies kind of saw what they were doing and understood the strategy. The potential still exists for a niche market in video game collecting. Music is increasingly being published on vinyl and even audio cassettes for sentimental purposes, but things are far dicier when it comes to games. Even now, a new Nintendo game will frequently have a day one patch and then subsequent changes and downloadable content. There are examples of titles, particularly on the early Switch, which were launched as decidedly bare-bones experiences and essentially finished in public. Mario Tennis Aces and Kirby Star Allies spring to mind. Even where a game on a disc is a definitive edition, is it actually permanent? With a book, despite paper being delicate, there is a reasonable chance that the book will remain readable centuries into the future as long as it is looked after. CDs are pretty long-lived but can degrade, as do game cartridges, and the likelihood remains that modern game cards could have shorter lifespans still. Also, frequently, encryption technology exists to ensure that even if you own the item, you can't actually use it in your system without the machine accessing the internet to get the green light from Skynet Central. And that's before we get to other diminutions of the form. In 2025, Nintendo introduced game keycards, which weren't true physical copies, as they required a game download, seemingly at the request of third parties, and indeed third parties were definitely big adopters of game keycards, but also including the Pokemon Company with Pokopia. For those wishing that this would lead to a massive failure of the game, well, Pokopia has turned out to be one of the year's major sellers on the Switch 2 and is now to be a packing game with some versions of the console. It's difficult to imagine a full reversion to physical media being the primary means of accessing entertainment, but that's only because of assumption 3 and 4. Assumption 3 being that the marketplace remains broadly as it is now into the long term. Digital media requires your audience to have a consistent and uninterrupted access to an internet connection. Well, that's probably going to be the case going forward, but you could easily imagine short-term acts of sabotage or longer-term problems like a global war disrupting this significantly. This might seem like an obscure possibility, but of course Nintendo as a company survived the Cold War, both world wars, and actually probably benefited in an odd way from the Russo-Japanese War. Check out my feature-length deep dive into their founder Fusajiro Yamauchi on Patreon for more on that story. Essentially, in the very long term, distant prospects such as pandemics, wars, volcanic eruptions, and more become progressively more likely. Now, that's not to say that they should predicate a costly strategy on something they may be able to adapt around, but if there were some abrupt disruption in the global internet, the ability to switch seamlessly over to physical media at short notice could well be a huge and transformative benefit to a company like Nintendo, saving them potentially billions. Indeed, it doesn't necessarily need to be something so drastic. Let's say something far bigger happens than Terminator 2 facing Judgment Day. Let's say a major act of espionage deletes hundreds of thousands of films from a digital archive, meaning that certain movies which either were never recorded on film and were purely digital, or where significant changes were made without those being pressed onto film, or where the film has been allowed to degrade and so now functionally ceases to exist. All of those could be major issues for the film industry. Imagine Avengers Endgame being Thanos snapped out of existence. That's an ice cream sundae of irony with just a cherry of consternation on top. Assumption 4 is that there is a consensus on the best form of permanent storage. Put the case, and I'm deliberately being a bit whimsical here, but bear with me. Let's imagine that a company like Sony decides that they're going to listen to fans and they're going to launch the PlayStation Permanent. This is a $5,000 device that uses absolutely gargantuan cartridges to allow people to play games in their most perfect pristine form without any of the loading lags of digital media, and with cartridges engineered for longevity in mind, such that, with optimal storage conditions, they should be able to last for centuries. They would print 1,000 copies of each game only, and once those were gone, they're gone, with the market deciding the price these things go for. This would clearly be both a substantial improvement on the physical options available for any prior video game, and yet also so ruinously expensive to collectors that video game collection would cease to resemble other collecting hobbies like action figures or trading cards, and instead resemble art collection, which many would argue it actually is. This would answer the collection argument to a large degree, the preservation argument, while also making it commercially attractive to the companies, despite the fact that for many of the audience, it will be absolutely horrific, a complete monkey's paw version of a solution. I imagine there will be ongoing initiatives in the decades ahead to find some kind of accommodation on these issues, and we'll talk about some of them before the end of the video. I suspect, like vinyl, some version of this is probably the broad direction of travel, but it's hard to say for sure. Okay, we've talked a lot, but this is fundamentally a Nintendo channel, so let's now get back into the Nintendo of it. Where are Nintendo at now with regard to digital adoption? Despite the game keycards and despite now offering preferential prices for digital downloads compared to physical equivalents, Nintendo remains strongly reliant on physical media in the short term. Every August and November, I see headlines highlighting that Nintendo sales are pivoting drastically towards digital as investor reports show the numbers for April to September, and then we hit Christmas sales periods, and inevitably the physical copies reign supreme. There has been a gradual and progressive move towards digital, and that may be expedited in the years ahead if people choose lower cost options, and it kind of becomes standardized with the PlayStation that digital is just the way you access games. But fundamentally, the company is in absolutely no position at the moment to abandon physical media, and I think that will likely remain the case for at least the Switch 2 generation. Nintendo also does find utility in physical media, and they are still exploring alternatives. For example, they want people in physical brick and mortar stores seeing their content. Even if fewer people go to these shops, they still exist and they still have window displays. However, even there, it doesn't necessarily follow that game cartridges specifically need to continue. Selling bits of paper with codes is good for the retailers still. They can store much more inventory with far less space. It's good for Nintendo as the production cost of the bits of paper is derisory, and it scratches the itch for many of having something to wrap up and put under the Christmas tree, even if the gift might end up on the thin-looking side. Until now, that hasn't been the case. Routinely, their financials show that physical sales are strongly up in the October to December quarter compared to the rest of the year, as I say, but in theory this could change, and frankly, if they could make the codes a lot more attractive looking, they could probably push them a lot more. In this way, they can continue to honour their relationship with retailers and indeed customers while changing the narrative on how games are delivered. Now, digital download codes are not ideal. If Christmas morning goes from being able to shove a cartridge into the machine and shout, "Let's a go," to shoving a cartridge into the machine and spending 6 hours waiting for the game to download, that's less than ideal. It's also a perfect example of why to be skeptical about optional offers intended for convenience initially, but ultimately leading to inconvenience for the people the offers are supposed to benefit. I've seen a good example of this as the self-checkout at supermarkets. The self-checkout is useful for saving a queue, but when half the checkout staff have been laid off and it becomes an obligation on you to do the work for free that the supermarkets used to pay someone else to do for you, suddenly it takes on a different complexion. Previously, the job of making sure everything was loaded was for the producer of the games. Now it's on the customer to wait it out on Christmas morning while their turkey gets cold. Let's await. All that said, I think Nintendo do care about these kinds of fine details of their user experience. After all, they stuck with cartridges far longer than was, one might argue, strictly wise. However, all decisions come with a trade-off. Perhaps they would be better off solving this problem a different way. For example, by having their games download a very small part first, so that people already have something to play, while loading the rest of the game in the background. They have already found technical solutions to sharing and trading games, albeit ones mitigated by the constraints of Nintendo hardware, and game share seems to be something that has quite a lot of utility for them for the medium term. It's also not necessarily the case that parents would prefer physical items over digital. Nintendo caused mirth in 2017 by coating Switch cartridges in a substance that made it revolting to taste to stop young children, though not it would seem many social media influencers at the time, from putting the cards into their mouths. Still, cartridges aren't the massive great bricks of the 1980s, and inherently, the kinds of small parts like these are best kept away from younger children. At present, Nintendo are moving to have the physical games be slightly more expensive than the digital ones, and having a physical cost penalty does have some advantages. Firstly, it absorbs the additional production costs as it stands while fulfilling market demand, the best for all worlds. It's also likely that physical gamers will be more collector-minded, and so if it becomes worth maintaining physical copies, even if the print runs are relatively low, then this might be something where Nintendo can sell them other things besides just the games, amiibo and such like. Nevertheless, as the demand likely dwindles, it might become progressively more expensive, and physical editions could raise still further in price, and perhaps even cross into what we now think of as special editions. Even then, this has an advantage to Nintendo. One of the big problems they had with $80 Mario Kart is that it felt like a seismic leap in cost, even though from their perspective, it was essentially them trying to maintain the real terms price point of the games they had stuck with for a decade. $70 by contrast was curiously uncontroversial for Donkey Kong Bonanza, and frankly very few people made a song and dance about $80 Kirby and the Forgotten Land Nintendo Switch 2 edition, despite that feeling instinctively more egregious a price point than a top-tier AAA title that will probably receive support for a decade, like Mario Kart World. The reason for this is in part due to the anchoring effect. $80 was way outside what people had anchored in their minds as a price a game could sell at, but after Mario Kart World, even though people were begrudging of it, it became, if not accepted, then at least familiar that games could exist at that price, and so after the initial response, there wasn't quite the same consternation. In certain respects, it strikes me that the pivot to differential pricing also has this advantage in that Nintendo can at a future point, if need be, and inflation runs high, introduce a $90 physical title while keeping $80 as their digital price, and therefore soften the blow for the ultimately inevitable increase in price of the digital version as well. It will, of course, incur anger, but since most people will be able to buy at the then standard price of $80, it would probably be a more subtle way to push the pricing up. I'm not suggesting they should do this, of course, but I think it's definitely a helpful option for them to have. All that said, even Nintendo can't row against the tide forever. In 2017, they went with USB-C over their own bespoke cables for Switch, and while this was celebrated, it suggested a recognition that they couldn't be too far away from where the audience is. They have already moved a long way towards Nintendo Switch Online being at the heart of their preservation and ongoing sales efforts, and I've talked previously about how with this generation we are likely to start seeing increasingly versions of old games that probably will be, barring a few tweaks and nips and tucks here and there, basically the permanent definitive versions of classic titles that will last many generations to come. Short of just changing everything for the sake of changing everything, or a completely new technology emerging such as some permutation of VR, it's unclear that Star Fox 64 could have another new version that feels as decisive a leap forward as Star Fox 2026 was. Nintendo has a lot of classic games, but not an unending number. But there are specific considerations for Nintendo which do not apply to Microsoft, Sony, Steam, or whoever else. At Nintendo, at their heart, they are a toy company. That means that a perception of propriety is far more important to them than most. I don't think most people expect film and tech companies to be anything other than slightly sketchy. People might love their iPhone and enjoy Amazon delivery, and they may appreciate the effort that has gone into getting those products and systems right for everybody, and even feel that the money they spend is good value. But Nintendo appeals to children, and this incurs far more pressures and far more caution. It's not just perception of parents, although that is critical, but also governments will frequently legislate on behalf of children, and media arms are far more likely to jump on a story of a child impacted by a technology than a 40-year-old who just wanted to rewatch Terminator 2 Judgment Day. That's not to say Nintendo will duck controversy. As we've seen, they won't, but it's the type of controversy that's important. Nintendo sees its mission as explicitly intergenerational. Miyamoto and Furukawa both discussed, as I covered in a previous video, the notion of sowing seeds for future generations, that their initiatives in India or with their IP expansion efforts were essentially just to warm people up to the concepts of Mario so they could essentially sell products to those people's children 2 decades from now. This kind of patient long-termism is unusual in the entertainment industry, and I think it reflects the fact that Nintendo is not a rootless corporate entity seeking permanent optimization along purely financial criteria, not yet anyway, but comes from a tradition important to Kyoto specifically, where they are deeply grounded. Kyoto historically has been a place of craftsmen, of artisans, where traditions were handed down from generation to generation. Nintendo's founder, Fusajiro Yamauchi himself, very likely learned from his father the art of making the attractive Hanafuda cards that broke the company into the big time, and while these had a negative reputation, as did video games for much of the 20th century, Nintendo wanted people to have memories and a sense of fun and nostalgia, meaning that over many decades, people grew to love Nintendo content. A physical product on a shelf released decades before can still be a physical touchstone back to the past, a source of discussion, a point of memory, and so may in an odd way provide more utility than you might think from just the sale of a game. And yet, if that is the strategy, there is little evidence of it sticking around. Long gone are the days of beautiful colour instruction manuals and cartridges coming in robust plastic cases that protected them from dust and allowed you to carry them in bags and pockets without risk. Game cases now are considered top end if they have art on both sides of the sheet, and if not too huge a portion of the cover art is covered by notices such as exhorting the player to download a massive patch before playing. It's difficult to imagine a child valuing these items too much, and the risk for believers in physical editions is that generationally, people will just move on. So yes, I could see Nintendo ultimately, not in this decade and probably not next decade, but eventually going all digital. Certainly if you expect Shuntaro Furukawa to rally the gamers of the world with a modern-day St. Crispin's Day speech, it's not going to happen, is it? Except, here's the thing. We're only talking about the market as it currently is. One of the most critical concepts in economics, indeed I think one of the most critical concepts in life, is the idea of the opportunity cost. In simple terms, if you spend $80 on a game, you can't then spend that same $80 on having 4 or 5 pizzas delivered. You have cost yourself the opportunity to do something else. And of course, it's inevitably the case that the value of some of the opportunities you cost yourself will ultimately have far greater value than anything else you could do. It's probable in one of those party invitations you didn't go to, or in the newly opened supermarket you didn't check out, or on that plane trip you didn't take, or the degree course you didn't opt for, that there was someone who would have utterly changed the course of your life, a life partner, a business partner, a friend, or indeed something far darker. It could be the path not taken was a path you really didn't want to take. The art of business, as in life, is of seeing the potential of value in uncertain conditions and choosing the right path, minimizing the opportunity cost as far as you can. The opportunity cost for Nintendo of going all digital is that, well, everyone else is doing it. That opens up a unique market that if they are playing their cards right, they can corner. Nintendo becomes the place where you can buy a game and put it into your pocket, where you can hold the game and collect it. If they've effectively cornered that market, they have far more flexibility than up the price. Okay, they can say the PlayStation 6 is the best looking version of the game, but we have the one that you can trust to still be with you for decades to come. Now that relies of course on third parties playing ball, and while I suspect enough might eventually be interested under certain conditions, I don't think the current conditions are anywhere near optimal to entice third parties to make Switch 2 a place for physical games to reside. I don't think physical editions therefore can continue to look like they do on Switch 2 if this plan is to work. Thin plastic cases, tiny and dreary looking cards, which are literally designed to make you want to vomit if, for whatever weird reason, I'm not judging, you decide to give them a lick. Quite what they do look like, I don't know. Obviously there's a space for retro-styled consoles, but I don't think you can predicate a sales strategy on this kind of thing either. What about if games looked more like Amiibo? You buy the toy, shove it on the stand of your machine, and instantly it boots up Mario 64. Let's go, the toy and you both say in perfect, joyous unison. When you're done with the game, pick it up and put it on the shelf next to the various statuettes that are the physical embodiments of all the different Zelda games in your collection, a few Samuses, a Cloud for Final Fantasy VII, and the ultra-expensive model of the N64 that has dozens of N64 games on it. Rumour has it that next year's line of toys will include GameCube and Game Boy Advance games. Maybe there'll even be an anti-figurine for Advance Wars. As it happens, I didn't completely make this idea up. For people who haven't encountered the Tony box, they have a similar concept but for music, where you can put a character on the stand and listen to music linked to that character. I'm sure it's not yet possible to meaningfully store a huge game on a toy, but it may be one day, and under these circumstances, I could see third parties being far keener to adopt the technology. Imagine how collectible they would be, how appealing, and then just think 10 years on what happens when the company releases the new versions, where the toys move, where the toys are shiny, or so on. Suddenly, everything can be sold as new, and people will buy the products again because they perceive new and fresh utility. Basically, what I'm talking about is that the physical market needs a conceptual boot up the backside. Books have had to compete with digital readers for years and have done so from focusing on the aesthetic appeal, on products that draw conversation in the home and that serve a broader purpose besides simply having some text in them. This means that they incur a higher cost, but it does also mean that they have survived where it was broadly expected that books might wither away over the course of this century. Similarly, I do expect that physical media is going to have to become a lot more than just providing access to games, as it currently is. Sony and Microsoft are ill-equipped to make this kind of pivot, even if they wanted to. I suspect vanishingly few people are keen to show on their shelves their Sony Walkman or an unopened edition of Windows 95, but if you've got a Super Nintendo in the corner of your room, it's still a statement, and that's without Nintendo basically putting in any effort. Imagine if they tried. And I think they will try for no other reason than it's overwhelmingly in their interest to do so, in a way that it's not for Sony and Microsoft for reasons I've previously outlined. As technology and entertainment modes combine, Nintendo risks being frozen out. If they're reliant on films through their IP strategy, well, most of the means of playing those films won't be owned by Nintendo. If 20 years from now Sony entertainment hubs, which used to be called televisions, have 1,000 PlayStation games built in, what need do parents have to buy a Nintendo console? The solution they need to take, the solution they've always sought to take before, is to sail well away from the White Star Line's route and into the wide blue ocean and do something different in the space. Of course, once Nintendo show a path, others may and probably will follow. I frankly doubt that 2027 will be the last year we ever see any kind of physical PlayStation release, but the incentives line up far more for Nintendo than Sony to try to make a big pivot in this field. Nintendo need to be scrappy, and while they might not go into every market, making their games physical objects to be treasured is really squarely in their wheelhouse. But that's just one example, one possibility of how they could go. The point is that the solution space is completely beyond where we currently are, but where unmet demand lies, potential still remains, and I think Nintendo will be exploring that potential. The key is going to be how to turn a matter of niche interest, having a physical version of a game, into something with broad commercial potential, but I think that is possible. At any rate, shout out your best and boldest ideas in the comment. Please do check out the Patreon for early, exclusive and ad-free content, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.